It's harder with Russia than most other countries.
I'm sure that President Biden didn't, lean through the video call to Putin and start talking company names and bank names, did he? But what do you think he would have said to make it very clear that this was a hammer blow of sanctions threatened?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And you don't want to tip your hand for a variety of reasons, and you don't want to, if you're sitting there in Biden's chair, like, yeah, drawing red lines is really freaking dangerous with Putin, because he'll just go slightly in a different direction, and then you're left with, well, I've threatened this huge, massive action, and he hasn't done exactly what I set the red line at. And Biden will know this well, right? This was one of the Obama administration's biggest challenges.
But he would have said to him, what? We will bring your banking to its knees?
we are going to destroy at least some of, if not all of, your state-owned banks. We are coming for your economy if you do this, and not just the things that they've done now, which are constraining but not death sentences, right? U.S. sanctions on a bank are a death sentence. Bank Russia, the famous crony bank in Russia that we hit in 2014, overnight went from being a fairly large international Russian bank. It was top 20 maybe, or something like that. I forget exactly how big it was, but it had lots of international connections. Overnight, it was a ruble-only bank, and it only survived because of Russian government patronage. They switched, things like utilities payments to have to flow through Bank Russia for people in Russia, things like that. U.S. sanctions on banks essentially are a death knell. They don't exist functionally, especially internationally.
Before we move from the sectoral discussion, and I know we could go through a lot of stuff, but do you think that some of the sectoral sanctions should expand into beyond oil and gas, into mining, coal, other things?
I mean, I think there are calculations that they have to make about all of this, right? There are supply chain issues at the moment that may be exacerbated by going after Russian minerals. It doesn't mean that they're unsolvable or they're bad ideas, but they have to understand the impact.
Like steel, for instance, if you go after steel, they export a lot of steel.
Yeah, and right. The whole point of sanctions is to hurt the other guy, not yourself, right?
Right.
And so you have to make sure that you're not cutting off your nose to spite your face. And that's a tough calculation, and that may augur against some of the say Evraz or the other big kind of Rusal, the other big minerals companies. It may mean that something like Alrosa is not a bad target, though, because the diamond market isn't, necessarily as central to the global economy. So some of those things you might see start to create, I would expect if Russia rolls across the border, there's a package of sanctions that's centered around banks, a handful of other companies, some cronies, and then a whole bunch of people who are precipitating the conflict in Eastern Ukraine. Right?
Cronies, you mean like inner circle?
Yeah, like Alisher.
But we've talked about that a lot, right? I mean, the again and again, we've heard that sanctions target his inner circle. I mean, how big is this circle, and haven't they already been sanctioned, a lot of them?
Well, I think of it as like concentric circles, right? So the true inner circle, like the guys who have all their dashas in the same place outside of St. Petersburg, like those guys, the Rodenbergs, Timchenko, they've all been sanctioned. Kovalchuk. Deripaska, is kind of that next circle out from like the true inner circle. And then there's a whole category of people I think that fit in there. Usmanov and others probably fit somewhere in that circle or the next one out. And I think that's where it goes, is you see the focus on the inner one and then kind of radiating out as more and more cronies get sanctioned. That's at least, I think, the escalation ladder.
A lot of people won't know those names, but there are many other names that are, Russian oligarchs, and the media loves to use the term, we're going to go after the oligarchs.
Yeah.
But is some of that unfair, because some of those wealthy Russians who made their money after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in fact, a lot of them have put their kids into British schools and tried to move abroad and tried to move away from the Kremlin, and had their companies seized by the Kremlin and Putin's inner circle. And I mean, not because you're an oligarch doesn't mean you're pro-Putin and you should automatically be a target of sanctions, right?
I think that's right, and I think that's where the administration's head is too. It's this kind of delicate determination of if they're operating in country, are they just kissing the ring, or are they more actively involved? And, I think with somebody like Deripaska, with some of the allegations swirling around the 2016 election, and other things, it was, the calculation was probably made, look, this goes beyond just like, you exist in Russia as a businessman, and therefore you have to pay homage to this guy who styles himself as the, the czar. And where you draw that line may be different depending on kind of who's making decisions. But I think it's absolutely fair characterization to say that not all Russian oligarchs deserve to be sanctioned, because not all Russian oligarchs are, kind of pro-Putin flag wavers.
This has been many times described as a kleptocracy.
Yes.
When the U.S. Treasury puts sanctions on some of the inner circle, the ever expanding circle, do you think that they can bring a lot of pressure to bear on Putin himself, because the people around him at a certain point say, wait a minute, that's our money in those banks, that's our wealth, and at a certain point it destabilizes the regime?
The theory is that you can exert pressure on Putin by going after the people around him, right, and going after their money. Whether that destabilizes the regime or not, I'm a little skeptical of regime destabilization as a desirable goal just in general, right? I worry about power vacuums in Russia and whoever's coming next, because even administering like the state of Russia is, I don't know, Putin has killed all opposition, both literally and figuratively. So it's not as if there are people ready to step in. But yeah, I mean, the idea is when you go after Deripaska, regardless of what people think about the deal with Rusal, like Deripaska's net worth has been reduced by many billions of dollars. And that has to have some impression, or at least mental pressure, on Deripaska for how he deals with Putin, right? And if you get more people in that boat, maybe you get at least some push for moderation of policy. Putin relies on that patronage network and corruption to stay in power. And so if you undermine the spoils of that, you undermine the power structure that he sits on top of.
And he has to weigh very simply, what am I going to get out of this in terms of strategic influence in the region, and what's this going to cost us? And if you're bringing them to the brink of economic, I wouldn't say collapse, but some pretty deep pain inflicted, he should blink.
That's the hope. That's the hope, is if you push hard enough and Biden kind of conveyed enough of a credible threat, that the cost, which Putin may have calculated in recent years, have gone down, right? The chance that the Europeans would impose significant sanctions, he may have been skeptical of. But I think the message has been much stronger out of Washington, London, and Brussels over the last 2 weeks than maybe the Kremlin expected.
Can you just very quickly go back to the whole discussion of SWIFT payments?
Yeah. So SWIFT is just a messaging system, right? Like, all it is essentially, I mean, this is a gross oversimplification of the service they provide, but it's essentially like WhatsApp or like secure email. There are ways if all you're doing is cutting off SWIFT, you're cutting off like the ability to send a message. You're not actually preventing transactions from taking place. So transactions are going to keep happening. It's just going to be less efficient. So SWIFT doesn't make a ton of sense if the point of imposing the sanctions is to, like, say, cut off a Russian bank from the global financial system. You impose the sanctions. You don't sanction just the kind of external messaging platform that the bank uses.
Could Russia turn around? I got it. Could Russia turn around and suddenly just start doing business in the euro and not do dollars and bypass U.S. sanctions?
No, not easily. The dollar capital markets are so deep and liquid that nothing else can replace it, and it's not close.
All right. Final question to you, because you've been watching all this unfold like the rest of us, and you were in on the original sanctions. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think that Biden delivered a tough enough message to President Putin, who seemed to be smiling through part of that meeting that we could see? He's pretty clever. He doesn't always, have a straightforward response to many things, including little green men here and hybrid warfare. But do you think that he is going to have to step back from the idea of invading Ukraine further?
I hesitate to say that he'll have to. I will say this. I think the message that the West has conveyed to Russia is extremely strong and aggressive. And I think in April, Putin may have calculated that the response from the West may have been here from a kind of financial pain perspective. I think he has to understand that it's much higher now. Whether that changes his calculus in terms of making a decision about whether to cross the border and potentially annex the LPR and DPR, or those big swaths of the Donbass, is I can't try to get inside his head the same way I couldn't try to predict Donald Trump. I'm hopeful, though, that the message is strong enough that those sanctions won't have to be used.
You feel confident that President Biden delivered the message he should have, that it was.
Yes, I'm confident that the message has been delivered well. I think there's been a lot of good thinking on it from both sides of the pond, including from Biden and his team, and I think they've come down stronger than I think a lot of people may have expected. So I'm hopeful that it's enough. Fearful that it's not.
Brian O'Toole, formerly with the U.S. Department of Treasury and now with the Atlantic Council. It's great to talk to you. Thank you so much for all that time.
Yeah, pleasure talking to you. Thanks for having me.